Close your eyes and imagine a world where a single empire's flag flies from the sun-drenched shores of California to the bustling spice markets of the Philippines. This was the reality of the Spanish Empire, a global superpower centuries before the rise of Britain or the United States. At its peak, the Spanish Empire commanded over 5 million square miles, a vast territory that stretched across much of the Americas and reached into Asia. Its rise to power was remarkably swift, transforming from a collection of small kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula to a dominant force on the world stage. Our journey begins in the late 15th century. Europe was alive with the ambition to discover new trade routes to the east. Portugal was already making headway exploring the African coastline, and then enters Christopher Columbus. Columbus, a seasoned Genoese sailor, believed he could reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. His vision was a vast, uninterrupted sea leading directly to the East Indies. He initially sought funding from King John II of Portugal, but his proposals were met with skepticism. However, word of Columbus's audacious plan reached the court of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain. Eager to establish their own overseas trade routes and rival the success of their Portuguese neighbors, they agreed to back Columbus's venture. After years of preparation and petitioning, Columbus set sail from Spain on August 3, 1492, with 3 small ships, the Nina the Pinta and the Santa Maria. Over 2 months later, on the morning of October 12th, they made landfall on an island Columbus named San Salvador. Believing he had reached the East Indies, Columbus named the native inhabitants Indians. He continued his explorations, charting much of the Bahamas, northern Cuba, and Hispaniola before returning to Spain in January 1493 with news of lands ripe for the taking. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand were ecstatic with the discoveries and promptly dispatched Columbus on a second voyage, this time with a fleet of 17 ships. He charted more of the Caribbean, and during his third voyage between 1498 and 1500, he made the first contact with the mainland of South America. It was at this point that Columbus realized he had stumbled upon an entirely new continent. His fourth and final voyage from 1502 onwards saw Columbus exploring the coastline of Central America. When he got in 1506, he might have been somewhat disappointed not to have found his westward sea route to Asia. But he had inadvertently set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the world. The discovery of these new lands, however, sparked a problem. Who would control them? A race to claim territory ensued between Spain and Portugal, leading to the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. With Pope Alexander VI acting as mediator, the treaty effectively divided the world outside Europe into 2 spheres of influence, one for Spain and one for Portugal. At the time, it was believed this granted Spain control over most of the Americas. Later, it would be discovered that Brazil fell within Portugal's designated region. Even as the Treaty of Tordesillas was being negotiated, the Spanish were already establishing a foothold in the New World. The first permanent Spanish settlement, Santo Domingo, was founded by Bartholomew Columbus, Christopher's brother, on the island of Hispaniola in 1496. From there, a wave of Spanish settlements spread across the Caribbean in the early 16th century. Cuba became a central hub of the burgeoning Spanish Empire after its conquest in 1515, with Havana becoming a key port. Exploration of the American mainland continued, and in 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama, becoming the first European to lay eyes on the Pacific Ocean. But the Spanish ambitions extended far beyond the islands of the Caribbean. The heart of Native American civilization lay on the mainland, particularly in Central America. By the time the Spanish arrived, the dominant power in the region was the Aztec Empire. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was a magnificent city built on a lake accessible only by grand man-made causeways. Initial Spanish forays into the Yucatan Peninsula in 1517 led to reports of a wealthy and powerful empire to the west. Intrigued by these tales, the conquistador Hernán Cortes set sail from Havana on November 18, 1518, landing on the Mexican coast a few weeks later. In the summer of 1519, Cortes established the settlement of Villarica de la Vera Cruz, which became his base of operations. He began venturing inland, skillfully forging alliances with native peoples who had been conquered and oppressed by the Aztecs, most notably the Tlaxcala. By early November, Cortes reached the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs, led by their emperor, Montezuma II, greeted the Spanish with a mixture of awe and apprehension. They saw the Spaniards clad in metal armor and wielding unfamiliar weapons as potential gods, but were also wary of their intentions. Cortes, with his small contingent of men, seized control of Tenochtitlan, taking Montezuma hostage and calling for reinforcements from the Caribbean. He held sway over the city for 6 months, but tensions between the Spanish and the Aztecs grew. On June 29, 1520, a clash erupted, and Montezuma was killed by his own people while attempting to quell the unrest. That night, known as La Noche Triste, the sad night, Cortes and his men were driven from Tenochtitlan, losing nearly all the treasure they had amassed. Undeterred, Cortes regrouped his forces, which numbered fewer than 1,000 Spaniards, but were bolstered by their native allies. Over the following months, he prepared for his return to Tenochtitlan. By the spring of 1521, Cortes had surrounded the city, commencing a brutal siege that lasted 10 weeks. The ensuing battle marked the fall of the Aztec Empire. Many Aztecs had already succumbed to European diseases like smallpox, to which they had no immunity. Millions perished in the wake of these outbreaks. Those who survived the plagues then faced the wrath of the Spanish and their native allies who stormed the city. The Tlaxcala, eager to eradicate all traces of their former oppressors, were particularly ruthless in their sacking and looting of Tenochtitlan. The city was razed, its inhabitants slaughtered. In its place, the Spanish established Mexico City, which became the administrative capital of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. But the Aztecs were not the only advanced civilization in the Americas. Far to the south, high in the Andes Mountains, the Inca civilization had risen to become the dominant power in the region, controlling much of modern-day Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia. The Spanish made contact with the Incas in the mid-1520s. Two conquistadors, Francisco Pizarro and Diego de Almagro, led a band of men into Peru aiming to conquer the Inca Empire. Their first expedition in 1528 met with limited success. However, like Cortes in Mexico, they inadvertently introduced smallpox to the region, decimating the native population and weakening resistance to the coming Spanish conquest. Pizarro returned to Peru in 1531 with royal authorization to lead a new expedition against the Inca Empire. A protracted war ensued, lasting throughout much of the 1530s. Unlike Cortes' swift victory in Mexico, Pizarro faced a more challenging campaign. The Inca Empire was more decentralized and geographically dispersed than the Aztec Empire. Furthermore, the Spanish conquistadors themselves were riven by internal conflicts with Pizarro and his brothers, leading one faction against the Almagro faction. This resulted in a virtual civil war among the Spanish, even as they waged war against the Incas. Pizarro himself was eventually killed by Diego de Almagro II in 1541. By then, however, the Spanish had established control over much of the Inca Empire. They governed the region directly from their newly founded capital at Lima. In 1542, the Viceroyalty of Peru was established as a counterpart to the Viceroyalty of New Spain. However, Inca resistance continued well into the 1570s. The conquest of the Aztecs and Incas and the establishment of the Viceroyalties of New Spain and Peru laid the foundation for the Spanish Empire in the Americas during the 16th century. But their expansion continued. In the late 1530s, the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto embarked on a series of explorations along the northern frontier of New Spain, charting much of what is now the southern United States. She journeyed from Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas westward to Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. De Soto encountered advanced civilizations in these regions, mound-building cultures, living in substantial towns and cities like Etowah and Cahokia. However, despite bringing back knowledge of these regions, no concerted efforts were made to colonize them for many years, save for some tentative settlements along the Florida coastline and in southern Texas. Simply put, there was more readily available and desirable land closer to Mexico City and other core areas of the Spanish Empire. Meanwhile, far to the south, Juan Díaz de Solís became the first Spanish explorer to chart the mouth of the Rio de la Plata around modern-day Argentina and Uruguay in 1516. Another explorer, Pedro de Mendoza, led an expedition to the region 20 years later, establishing the settlement of Buenos Aires on February 2, 1536. However, much like in North America, large parts of Argentina and neighboring Chile remained virtually untouched by the Spanish for many decades. Spanish expansion across the Americas was a gradual process primarily focused on Mexico and Peru. While these conquests were unfolding in the Americas, a Spanish colony was also being established across the Pacific Ocean. When Ferdinand Magellan circumnavigated the globe between 1519 and 1522, he discovered an archipelago of islands in eastern Asia that lay within Portugal's sphere of influence as defined by the Treaty of Tordesillas. Further explorations of these islands were undertaken in the 1540s, during which they were named Las Islas Filipinas, or the Philippine Islands, in honor of Prince Philip, the heir to the Spanish throne. It was only after Prince Philip ascended to the throne as King Philip II in 1556 that a military expedition was finally sent to establish a Spanish colony in the Philippines in the mid-1560s. The northern island of Luzon, the largest in the archipelago, was swiftly conquered, and the city of Manila was founded in 1571. The Spanish faced fierce resistance from the Muslim inhabitants of the southern island of Mindanao and adjacent smaller islands. As in the New World, Spanish rule in the Philippines was fragmentary from the outset, with only Luzon effectively under their control. Nevertheless, their settlement in the Philippines provided Spain with a strategically vital foothold in Asia and the East Indies. As the Spanish Empire continued its expansion in the 16th century, it became clear that immense sums of money would be needed to finance the men and materials required to maintain their hold on these vast territories. Fortuitously, vast gold and silver mines were discovered in Mexico, Bolivia, and Peru shortly after the conquest of the Aztecs and Incas. The Spanish began extensive mining operations, exploiting native populations for forced labor. One notable site was the Cerro Rico near Potosi in Bolivia, a veritable mountain of silver discovered in 1545. Over the next 2 centuries, it would produce 80% of the world's silver supply. This bullion was transported overland to ports like Cartagena in Colombia, and then assembled into an annual treasure fleet that sailed back to Spain. The sheer volume of gold and silver flowing into Spain's coffers was so vast that it triggered a period of global inflation known as the Price Revolution in the second half of the 16th century. Imagine that silver from the New World causing economic upheaval across Europe. It makes you wonder if this influx of wealth ultimately contributed to Spain's later decline. As more and more Spaniards arrived in the Americas, a complex colonial society began to emerge. Most of those who set off from Spain for the New World in the 16th century were single men, often younger sons of Spanish nobility seeking their fortunes. Conversely, very few women made the journey. Consequently, many Spanish men in Mexico, Peru, and other regions married native women. This led to the emergence of a mixed race or mestizo population across the empire. To understand the social hierarchy that developed, you need to know the key terms. Peninsulares were those born in Spain, often holding the highest positions in government and the church. Creoles were people of Spanish descent born in the Americas. And finally, mestizos, those of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry, formed a growing segment of the population. This new social order was characterized by the dominance of the Spanish language and the prevalence of Catholicism in all aspects of colonial life. From the late 16th century onwards, the arrival of slaves from West Africa became increasingly common, particularly in the Caribbean. The burgeoning sugar plantations demanded a large workforce, and enslaved Africans were brought in to meet this demand. A tragic chapter in human history, reminding us of the dark side of empires and the exploitation that often accompanies them. Despite the seemingly endless stream of treasure being extracted from the colonies by the beginning of the 17th century, there was already a decline in the amount of gold and silver arriving back in Spain. Moreover, the Spanish government under King Philip II was spending lavishly on wars in Europe, leading to 4 declarations of bankruptcy during his reign. This mismanagement of resources, coupled with the diminishing supply of precious metals from the New World, marked the beginning of the decline of the Spanish Empire. It's a classic case of overspending and perhaps a lack of foresight in diversifying their economy. By this point, Spanish conquests and territorial expansion in the Americas had largely ceased. There were no more major civilizations like the Aztecs or Incas to subjugate. More importantly, the French, Dutch, and English had begun to stake their claims in North America, occupying much of the land that Spain had claimed, but neglected to settle and colonize effectively. These European rivals also began to challenge Spanish dominance in the Caribbean, vying for control of the islands. For example, England seized Jamaica from Spain during the Anglo-Spanish War of 1654-1660. All of this was symptomatic of the growing stagnation of the Spanish Empire in the 17th century. By the turn of the 18th century, Spanish colonial society had matured, with settlements spanning a vast territory from northern Mexico to Chile and Argentina. Some regions remained largely unexplored, notably the arid Atacama Desert high in the Andes and the dense disease-ridden jungles of Guyana. These areas remained largely uninhabited by the Spanish. However, 2 areas that attracted increasing interest during the second half of the 18th century were California and Texas. The southwest of California in particular was being explored by the Franciscan missionary Junipero Serra and his followers from the late 1760s onwards. Over the next decade, they established a dozen mission settlements along the California coastline, which would later serve as the foundations for cities like San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Meanwhile, in the more established centers of Spanish colonial rule, Mexico City, Lima, Buenos Aires, and Santiago divisions were growing. By the 18th century, remember those social classes we talked about? Well, the Creoles and mestizos in particular increasingly believed that the colonies would be better off governing themselves. Seeds of discontent were being sown, setting the stage for the revolutions to come. Although the Spanish Empire had clearly stagnated by the end of the 18th century, it had not yet collapsed. However, events in Europe would ultimately seal its fate. By 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France, had decided to seize control of Spain and install his brother Joseph as its king. This act triggered a series of uprisings across South and Central America. Leaders like José de San Martín in Argentina, Bernardo O'Higgins in Chile, Simón Bolívar in Venezuela and Colombia, and Miguel Hidalgo in Mexico emerged, galvanizing movements for independence. Between 1808 and 1810, wars of independence erupted across these regions, with colonial nationalists seizing the opportunity created by France's occupation of Spain to throw off Spanish rule altogether. They were opposed by royalist and pro-Spanish factions within each country, particularly the Peninsulares. These wars of independence were protracted and brutal conflicts dragging on throughout the 1810s. Furthermore, once the legitimate King Ferdinand VII was restored to the Spanish throne in 1813, Spanish state aid once again flowed to the colonies to suppress the rebellions. Despite these challenges, Simón Bolívar led a successful revolution across Venezuela, Colombia, and Panama, resulting in the establishment of Gran Colombia as an independent state in 1819. This was formally ratified in 1821. He then campaigned further south, using his resources to liberate Peru from Spanish rule, culminating in victory at the Battle of Ayacucho in December 1824. By that time, José de San Martín and others had already secured Argentina's independence from Spain in 1816. Chile followed suit with its declaration of independence in 1818, although the war against Spain there continued until 1826. Further north, after 11 years of intermittent warfare, Mexico finally broke free from the Spanish Empire in 1821, briefly establishing itself as the First Mexican Empire before transitioning to the First Mexican Republic in 1823. The revolutions of the early 19th century effectively dismantled Spain's vast overseas empire. However, a few pockets of territory remained under their control, which they clung to jealously for the remainder of the 19th century as the last vestiges of their former national greatness. These included Cuba, Puerto Rico, and several other small Caribbean islands, as well as the Philippines and Asia. As Spain was increasingly racked by political instability at home throughout the 19th century, these remaining colonies experienced guerrilla warfare and insurrections as movements for independence gained momentum. Ultimately, it was the Cuban War of Independence, which began in 1895, that ushered in the final chapter of Spain's once mighty empire. The war dragged on for several years, eventually prompting the United States to intervene in 1898. The ensuing Spanish-American War was a brief and decisive conflict that resulted in Spain's defeat. They were forced to relinquish control over Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, all of which became U.S. dependencies to varying degrees. And so the vast and immensely wealthy Spanish Empire, which began with a chance discovery by a Genoese sailor, came to an end after 400 years. Its rise and fall offer a captivating glimpse into the complexities of empire, the allure of wealth, and the enduring human spirit that yearns for freedom. The Spanish Empire's legacy is multifaceted. It left an undeniable imprint on the languages, cultures, and societies of the Americas and the Philippines. It connected continents, facilitated the exchange of goods and ideas, and left behind architectural marvels and artistic masterpieces that continue to inspire awe. But it also serves as a sobering reminder of the human cost of empire, the exploitation, oppression, and injustices that often accompany the pursuit of power and wealth. As we reflect on the Spanish Empire's journey, we're left with the question: what lessons can we learn from its triumphs and failures? How can we ensure that the pursuit of global influence and interconnectedness doesn't come at the expense of human dignity and freedom? These are questions that resonate even today as we navigate a world grappling with the legacies of colonialism and striving for a more just and equitable future.